people are just now racing to put the first tool out there that's going to make some money, right? They're building the minimal viable product to convince people that there's now, in quotes, AI involved, and it's going to give you the right dosage or the right care. And the reality is there's nothing further from the truth right now.
Welcome to the Dutch Podcast, where we dive deep into the science of hormones, wellness, and personalized healthcare. I'm Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton, Chief Medical Officer at Dutch. Join us every Tuesday as we bring you expert insights, cutting-edge research, and practical tips to help you take control of your health from the inside out. Whether you're a healthcare professional or simply looking to optimize your own well-being, we've got you covered. The contents of this podcast are for educational and informational purposes only. This information is not to be interpreted or mistaken for medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment. Hi there, and welcome to this week's episode of the Dutch Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here with me today. This is such a juicy episode and a juicy topic. It's one that you guys have asked us to cover in more depth for a long period of time, and it's all about lab testing when it comes to longevity and extending health span, and what are all the things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to lab testing. Today's guest is an expert in that. Dr. Darshan Shah is the founder of Next Health, which is a series of clinics around the country that really focuses on what he calls hyper-preventive medicine. They do quarterly lab testing, plus using all of the biometric data that we can gather on our own to really help guide patients to their optimal health. And I think from my point of view, their clinics really have it in the bag as far as a system to be able to utilize data, utilize AI, and utilize the personalization that we still need as patients with our healthcare provider to really get good care for patients. We talked in this episode all about the standard labs that should be run and also some of the additional functional labs that they run and depend upon frequently, things that address these core root causes of health. The other thing I really loved about this conversation is that we went over and over and over again back to the idea that so many labs that are tested right now in healthcare are what we'd call lagging indicators. It's like the last thing to change. Dr. Shah talks about CBC and a comprehensive metabolic panel. That's the last place that we see changes occur. But for so many different conditions, there are leading indicators or leading measures. Some of them are in our wearable data. Some of them are in blood. Some of them are on Dutch and on other functional tests that can pick up problems sooner and help you actually intervene before you have a disease state. I know you want to know what those are. I'm going to let Dr. Shah tell you. Without much further ado, I want to welcome our guest today. Dr. Darshan Shah, like I said, he's a board-certified surgeon, came from a surgical background, and really transitioned into a longevity medicine specialist. Like I said, he's the founder of Next Health, the world's first and largest health optimization and longevity clinic. He's performed over 20,000 surgical procedures and advised thousands of patients on improving their metabolic health, their health span, and their lifespan. I'm really excited to have you today. Let's get started. So, Dr. Shah, it's so great to have you back on the Dutch Podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Can't believe I'm on here a second time. Thank you for having me again.
It's been like a full year, just over a year. And this time I can hear you so much better because we're not in the expo hall with so much noise behind us.
Yeah, that is a noisy expo hall.
It is. Yeah, we had recorded our last podcast live at A4M, which was so much fun and such a great, vibrant environment. But this makes it like we can really dive into a lot of great, juicy detail today. So I'm thrilled.
Let's do it.
So I don't know that we really got to capture last time we talked to you, like a little bit about your backstory, because you came from a traditional medical background, but you've really shifted into longevity and preventive care. And now you have this business, Next Health, which is really next level care. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to get here?
Yeah, so it all came, they always say necessity is the mother of invention, right? And so I started off, I've been a doctor now for 30 years. My first 20 years was spent being a surgeon. So I was in the operating room every single day, 14 hours a day, sometimes 5, 6, 7 days a week, many times. And, being a physician, the more treatment you put forth, the more surgeries you do, the more money you make, right? So obviously, I was kind of stuck in that whole world of just, I was just chasing a tail. I was like on a hamster wheel of just doing tons of surgery, grew a big, giant business with that, which then makes you have to work more because now you're managing hundreds of employees and seeing hundreds of patients. And I just got stuck in that. And so I found myself 10 years ago not having taken care of myself for 20 years. I had all sorts of medical issues and autoimmune problem, hypertension, diabetes, and also major hormonal dysregulation. And so I, out of my own need to get better, which I wasn't finding in the kind of the Western care model, I went and saw advice in functional medicine, and I got better. And I thought to myself, I'm done being a surgeon. I want to I want to do something different. I really was inspired with my own journey, getting first of all, of course, my lifestyle in order, but then also my hormones in order, and my gut health in order, and it all just tied together. And I said, why does everyone not have access to this? And I started a new clinical business called Next Health, and now that's grown to over 25 locations all over the world, and we're expanding that even further.
Yeah, Next Health is a really exciting model. Can you share a little bit about it with our listeners?
Yeah, so I basically wanted a place to go for people that was kind of the opposite of what Western medical care was offering. So we wanted beautiful environments where people could actually be fully engaged in their health and wellness journey. Number one, to reverse chronic disease, but also number two, just to feel incredible. And so we designed offices that were, people call us the Apple Store of health and wellness, because when you walk in, there's all sorts of treatments you can do, anything from hyperbaric oxygen therapy to IV therapy to hot cold contrast therapy, but also you can meet with fully trained functional medicine and longevity medicine practitioners that can help you reverse chronic disease and help you start feeling great again. And so we treat everything from mold to Lyme to reversal of diabetes, reversal of metabolic disease to mitochondrial dysfunction. We do everything, and we really just help people feel better. And that's kind of what we're doing in Next Health.
That's great. Now, one of the things that really kind of just leads us so nicely into the topic of today's podcast, because I really see you as one of the leading experts in data-driven decision-making in medicine, particularly in longevity medicine. And I think now there's so much out there and so much available for people with like devices to biohack. I actually left my Oura ring next to my tonal. I like lifted this morning and just realized I forgot to put my rings back on. But everyone's wearing some kind of tracking device. Of course, there's lots of labs available. There's functional labs, there's standard labs, there's do-it-yourself labs, more and more the direct-to-consumer. Can you talk a little bit about like how you view that landscape of how data is influencing people's ability to like expand their health span and what's working and what's not working?
Right. I would say it's an incredible time we live in, where we finally have more data that we have access to as patients that we can look at to help us drive our own personal decision making. And it used to be just 10 years ago, it was a world where you had to get a doctor's order to get a laboratory done, right? And now it's so different. You can get it all yourself. There were no wearables 10 or 15 years ago besides just a pedometer, right? And now you have all this data. And what it really enables, finally, for the first time, is we can stop practicing population-based medicine and move to a model where we do N of one medicine, right? And so N of one medicine is where you have access to your own data, and you can then use that data to see how particular interventions are working on you, not on a population basis. And so, every drug we have, every pharmaceutical, every surgery, we decide if it's going to be beneficial or not based on a randomized controlled trial. And basically what we're looking at there is a bell-shaped curve of, okay, here's this intervention. It works for most of the people, so let's try it on everybody and see what happens. And 95% of the time you have an okay reaction. That's what makes something safe to put out into the public. But 5% of people have a terrible reaction. They have horrible side effects, and it doesn't, and they can't take it. But what about all those people in between? Those people that have no response but are still doing an intervention, or people that are having even the opposite. You're having a great response and you just don't even know. And so finally, with access to our own data and multiple data points, we can now see how interventions are working for us as individuals. And we're moving into an era of N of one medicine, enabled not just by the massive amounts of data that we can collect, but now also in the last year enabled by AI. And putting all of this together is going to, I think, revolutionize health and healthcare in this century.
Yeah, it's really amazing how dramatically things have shifted when it
Mhm.
comes to both the behavior around data. Like it used to seem like physicians kind of owned labs and you had to go back in to get your results oftentimes. And I remember even being taught around you should have your patient in there to walk them through because if something's wrong, they need you at that time. And now it's so different
Mhm.
behaviorally with docs and our ability to collect. Just a funny story. Like I have spent my clinical years in like menstrual health, and I remember teaching women to do charting for their cycles to know what's going on. And the best innovation in my first, let's say, 5 years of practice was that there was a basal body temperature thermometer that came out,
Mhm.
oral thermometer, that because you had to wake up at the same time every day to take your
Mhm.
temp, that you could take your temperature and then put it on your nightstand, and then when you woke up later, you could, when you turn it on, it showed your last reading, so you didn't have to actually like chart it at that very moment. And I thought that was groundbreaking. So
Yeah.
we've come a long way now.
Yeah, it's really just accelerated. And in the next 5 years, we're going to see basically every piece of data that we have instantly accessible, evaluated, and feedback given to us on our phones, right? And
Hmm.
I think that that's going to come very quickly. Multiple different companies are doing this, and then we just have to find kind of a new place where is all this dust going to settle, right?
Yeah.
Because people still want human interaction with practitioners, and I think that's critical. I think there's a level of trust there. I think there's a level of empathy there that you're not going to get from an AI chatbot, right? But the practitioner also needs to be able to use these chatbots and these AI tools to make sure they're not missing something, to make sure they're fully considered mountains of data that they normally would not have time to review. And so we're going to see where all this dust settles, but I really do believe it's going to settle in a place where it's going to have the most positive impact on us as individuals.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you speak more about that because I think you're interfacing with that a lot. And that's a big question for a lot of us is like with the advent of AI. I mean, I know there's a lot of like new companies that pop up. Like in the menopause care space, there's a lot where you enter in a survey and then really what it looks like is that like bots are calculating and delivering recommended dosages. They're probably legally required to be reviewed by a physician before the prescription's written, but it's really an automated process now. And I think it's hard for consumers and patients to tell the difference
Yeah.
between what's a real human and what's not. What are some of the pitfalls or the problems that you've seen with this
Yeah.
so
I
far?
mean, exactly what you mentioned. People are just now racing to put the first tool out there that's going to make some money, right? And so they're doing
Exactly.
this kind of, they're building the minimal viable product to convince people that there's now, in quotes, AI involved and it's going to give you the right dosage or the right care. And the reality is, there's nothing further from the truth right now. People are just building the minimal viable product that is getting you to buy something. And that should be the first kind of
Mm.
alarm signal that goes off into people's heads if like you're taken to a path to buy something, right? And so simultaneously right now, like us at Next Health, we're building, there's many clinics building products that truly enable much better care, right? And the reason we're doing it is once again, necessity is the mother of invention. We see there's a lot of data being thrown at us. Our practitioners don't have time to fully evaluate and consider all the data. So we need something that's going to kind of consolidate the data for us. Also, we have AI available to really make sure we're not missing blind spots, right? And so I think AI is really good to tell the practitioner, have you considered this, this, and this, in addition to this, this, and this, right? And then we also now are building tools to educate patients more in an automatic fashion by using
Hmm.
AI to help us create educational documents, educational tools, emails, even chatbots where it's informed by the clinicians in what the clinicians understand about the patient, but then they don't really have the time to sit for hours and hours to fully explain. And so that's where we can use these tools to create that interface where patients can get educated because we really believe that there's nothing that's going to move the needle more for patients than to really understand what's going on with their body. So they almost need to become, um, you know, mini experts in their own body, in their own biomarkers, in a targeted fashion for what's affecting them at that moment in time.
Well, it's really empowering, right? When you
Yeah.
can see the information behind the way that you feel and you can see those metrics move and the way you feel change. It's certainly, not that every patient, we wish we could all just trust our own experience, but I mean, you and I both know in working with patients, they want to see those numbers shift as reinforcement, or they want to see them out of range to justify the behavior change that they really don't want to have to do, like, I don't know, eating vegetables or working out every day.
Yeah. And what I've seen is a lot of just a self-fulfilling prophecy when people see the data change, because we all know the data changes way before the symptoms
Oh,
come
yeah.
or reverse or change, right? And so when people see the data change, they are more motivated to continue those behaviors that move the data in the positive direction. And then they start feeling better. And they're like, oh, wow, this is all working. And so I think the data is critical. And for people to get the data and understand the data is critical. And, I know there's a lot of talk about data anxiety. My experience has been very few people have true data anxiety once you actually sit with them and you help them understand the data, and help and coach them through the process of making changes. And so we've been very successful in getting people to use the data to their advantage.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. I had another podcast guest last week where we were talking a little bit about just the feeling of overwhelm and anxiety that a lot of patients have about implementation of behavior change too, or that they feel as though they're the cause of their illness and they micromanage every input in their body when some would be more impactful than another. I'll give you an example. Just a friend of mine posted on social, and I thought this was such a great post where it's like, if you're going to take urolithin, but you're still drinking 2 drinks a night, like, don't come talk to me, right? Where it's like you're spending all this money on these quick fixes, and urolithin's a really impactful compound, a really beneficial compound. But the point being, you need to put your energy first where it's most necessary. In her case, that she was pointing out elimination of this toxin that really damages mitochondria. And I thought that was really resonant because you can put anxiety around all these micromanaging pieces, but really when it comes to longevity and health span, there's some core fundamental pieces that should be in play before you even layer things on, like all of the additional hyperbaric oxygen or whatever the other things you're going to layer on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has to all start with the base of the pyramid, which is getting the lifestyle changes solidified in your day-to-day routine. And that doesn't mean that you can't, have a drink of wine
Of
with
course.
dinner 1 or 2 nights a week. But obviously, like, if you're going to be drinking every single day, that's going to lead to long-term consequences that are way outweighed by any supplement that you're going to take. And so I think the data also then gives you the feedback that you are creating compounding damage. And drinking is a really good example because it's pretty immediate how quickly you can see the result in your sleep when you stop drinking for a few days in a row. It's massive, right? And so that's a really good example for me, and one I use quite frequently with my patients. Because to really prove someone that drinking is causing damage, it's hard, right? Until they start having liver function test abnormality. But when you show them the metrics of their sleep and how they improve after just taking 2 or 3 nights off, it can be a real game changer for people.
Those that feedback that you get from your body from those changes can be really impactful to be able to continue on, which is great.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of like single hormone or single marker hormone labs. So like we look at serum testing. We can measure estrogen, we can measure progesterone, et cetera, or we have these functional panels like the Dutch test. And I know that we're working to incorporate Dutch testing into the Next Health model, which it kind of brings it beyond that surface level hormone measurement. Can you talk a little bit about like why you think that's important for your patients, and as far as getting that, like, I call it a 3-dimensional hormone assessment?
I think it's a perfect way to describe it, right? I think that if, as practitioners, we have a responsibility to use all the tools available to us to really guide a patient's care. And when you're looking at a picture one moment in time of someone's blood markers, which we check them quarterly on our patients, it still doesn't give you a clear picture of what's going on. And you and I both know that your sex hormone system, your thyroid hormone system, your cortisol axis, and even your metabolic health, they're all tied together. They're all interwoven. They all affect each other. And so it's incredibly important to have more resolution into what's going on with someone's physiology when you're prescribing any treatments, right? And I'm really excited about bringing Dutch hormone testing into Next Health because it just gives us that more longitudinal analysis over the course of a day, and then but also it gives us kind of that three-dimensional view across many systems into how everything is interrelated and the interplay between those systems.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to break down about that because I think, especially on the role of cortisol on all the systems of health, including reproductive health. But it's making me think about one of the things you said earlier when it comes to like that N of one medicine. And one of the things that I've really started to use the Dutch test for more often is actually predicting response and outcome to treatment. And give you just a couple of examples. When it comes to putting men on testosterone, you can run a Dutch test first and see how they detoxify testosterone and estrogen. What are their estrogen levels? Are they clearing it properly? And it really can tell you a lot about whether a man on testosterone needs to also be on, DIM to clear estrogen or an aromatase inhibitor to prevent production and conversion. And you can almost see from that baseline pattern which men are going to have issues, which is really interesting.
It's so true. And like, this is something that is not typically available when you're just using blood testing. And I think it gives you the ability, number one, to prevent side effects, but also number two is to really optimize and dial in someone's treatment. And I think
Definitely.
that's really helpful.
Yeah. The other time I've seen it is with women. I know more and more women are getting on testosterone now. It's like it's the new hot thing. And we can tell also by how women metabolize androgens who makes the most potent metabolites. So I think a lot of people don't realize that with androgens, actually metabolites of testosterone are even stronger than testosterone itself when it comes to intracellular activity and kind of stimulating the hirsutism, acne, hair loss, hair change thing. So it's pretty interesting because, again, we could predict that, which women would have a harder time with the standard dose of testosterone, it's a fun way to be able to personalize even before they get on a therapy.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's why, a lot of these online hormone clinics, for example, I mean, it's mind blowing to me that some of them don't even test free testosterone before they're putting people on testosterone.
Right.
And, you're really creating a situation there where you can cause more problems than benefit. And the sad part about it is these problems don't really manifest themselves until you've been on the treatment for a long time. And by then, sometimes it's hard to reverse the side effects that you've created. And so I think starting off with a really clear plan with deep testing and then having markers to follow over time that are deeper than the standard should be the standard of care. It is not currently the standard of care, but I think it should be.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one challenge with that is just like economics and time. It's like, how do you do this in a way that's scalable for a clinic and then like able to be done by the average person? And I mean, my hope is that in the long term, our healthcare system will recognize that this comparatively small investment in analytics early on would guide preventive strategies that would prevent them from dropping into your old clinic in surgical care later on in life, or needing ongoing, therapeutic intervention that's really expensive from a drug perspective.
I mean, the reality is, and I would say the reality is that people should get their blood tests, urine tests done, in my view, quarterly. Like, I think that's when you have the most longitudinal data about what's happening in your biology, and then you could follow trends over time as well. And so we really believe in quarterly testing in Next Health, not for everything, but at least for the basic biomarkers. And then if someone is on hormone replacement therapy, we're going to measure a deeper hormone panel every quarter as well. And you'll catch problems early. You can make modifications and really dial someone in. Now, like you said, the economics of it make it difficult for a lot of people. But what I've seen over the last 10 years we've been running this business is the testing pricing is coming down significantly year over year, and there will be a world where it would become economically feasible for people to get quarterly testing.
I think that sounds really feasible. I mean, I look at like Function, and they've even lowered their price end of the last year, to like $365 a year. And again, this is like AI tool getting the insights. But even if you only consider the cost to get the labs drawn, I'll just tell you, I had I went into my PCP and I had some labs that I wanted to run for my wellness check. When it went through my insurance, my copay was over $1,000, and everything that was on that list was on Function's list, but it was only about 20% of what was on that list of what was tested. And it was like, why don't I just go direct to consumer and get all this data here? But when you think about the ability of labs to be run, I mean, like $400, even 4 times a year, from an insurance perspective, it's like nothing compared to the cost of an intervention.
Yeah,
So,
it tells you how broken our insurance system is. That the copay and the whole
yeah.
amount that's even being billed is massive. And then when Function can do it for $369 for a massive panel, then there's definitely something not right there. And it's in our insurance system, and the way the whole thing is built is just needs to be reinvented.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so like there's a world where everybody just gets a $300 massive panel every year, and that informs so much better care than having to go to the doctor, then pick the labs, and then get charged thousands of dollars for this for less labs.
You're right. I mean, even the visit to get the lab order is probably $300
Right,
to your insurance
exactly.
company. Right.
Exactly.
So why
It's
not just
crazy.
skip that step?
We'll be right back with more.
Join us this March at Dutch Fest in Dallas, Texas, where you become the hormone expert. If you're a registered Dutch provider, this is your invitation to 3 days of advanced hormone education, clinical insights, and hands-on case study-based learning. From March 12th through 14th, learn directly from founder Mark Newman, Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton, and Dr. Carrie Jones as you dive into focused sessions, discover real clinical applications, and explore practical testing strategies you can use immediately. The goal of Dutch Fest is to learn how to interpret the Dutch test with speed, confidence, and clarity. Spots are limited. Registered Dutch providers, secure your ticket now through your provider portal or by visiting DutchFest.com.
Welcome back to the Dutch Podcast.
I want to dive into more. I know this is an area that people are going to want to know more about, like from a leading clinic that's doing health span and longevity work. Can you talk through either the specific labs or the categories of labs? Like what is part of this quarterly panel for the average patient?
So what we do is we have what's called a quarterly baseline panel. And this baseline panel has about 45, maybe 48 markers in it. The markers are related to metabolic health, cardiovascular health, inflammation, micronutrient levels, and nutrition in general. And then we're also testing detoxification systems like liver, kidney, and hormones, right? And so we're doing more than just, a total testosterone level. We're diving a little bit deeper, and it's all through blood testing. I think most of the tests that we do are not standard tests that are being done at your physician's office, because these are tests that don't really point to any particular pharmaceutical intervention, but they help us catch problems early. So for example, we're using fasting insulin levels, triglycerides, hemoglobin A1C to track metabolic health. And we're big believers, as everyone is probably, that metabolic health is a foundation for overall health, and having poor metabolic health leads to a much higher incidence of all the chronic diseases. And so our main goal is to prevent and reverse chronic disease. So we're always measuring metabolic health. We're measuring inflammation, which HSCRP, homocysteine levels, and obviously we're doing cardiovascular health with ApoB, LP(a), a full cholesterol panel as well. And these are all very good indicators of what's going on at the root cause level. So at the root level, inflammation, mitochondrial health, hormone dysregulation, metabolic disease is what leads to all of the other thousands and thousands of named diseases out there. And so if we can really get down to the root causes and manage those and optimize those, we can avoid many diseases in the future.
I mean, I love hearing you describe that. And I love the way you describe, like, these are not things that would point to essentially a diagnosis and a pharmaceutical drug, because I think that's driven so much of the way modern medicine's practiced. Like, if you look at metabolic health, for example, really we'd follow fasting glucose. But I mean, I think hemoglobin A1C now is probably part of a routine screen for most clinics. But when you look at the surrounding ecosystem of metabolic health, most physicians are not ordering that. And it's because there's no need for it. Quote unquote, if you can't see, for like not on YouTube, if you're listening, there's no need to know that, because the only need is to know whether your fasting glucose is 126 and
Yeah.
whether you need to be put on, a treatment. I mean, maybe that's a little bit too harsh, because I mean, they put people on metformin or something a little bit sooner, but really the drive on decision making is, am I going to put a therapeutic in here versus what preventive action would I take?
And you'd be surprised, a lot of people bring their labs from their doctors to us. And they say, I don't need to get your baseline because I already got all my labs done at my doctor. And when you look at all my labs, in air quotes,
It's like TSH.
it's not even a TSH. It's just a CBC and a chem profile.
Okay,
you
yeah.
know?
Maybe
And
a
it's
urinalysis thrown
yeah,
in. Right?
yeah, and a urinalysis, right? But
Yeah.
this is what I ordered for decades as a traditional Western medicine doctor. When someone would come in, you get a CBC, a chemistry profile, and a urinalysis, and those don't have a hemoglobin A1C most of the time. And so you're right, more primary care doctors are checking hemoglobin A1C, but you and I both know that that is a lagging indicator in
Right.
metabolic health disturbances. When your hemoglobin A1C is finally affected and it starts going up, you've already probably been developing insulin resistance now for over a decade. And so you want to catch it much sooner. And the best blood work for catching any metabolic health deficiency sooner is going to be your fasting insulin level. And I
Yeah.
never see a fasting insulin, especially not preventatively. That's
Yeah.
usually reserved for when someone has already been diagnosed with diabetes,
Totally. Well, and then let's add a layer to this conversation, because I think when you look at lab normals, that's the other challenge, is if you're not specially trained, like fasting insulin, what's your target for like someone to say someone's in good metabolic health, like under 5?
Under 5 is my target. Yeah.
Okay. So, but then what does a normal lab say? Like under 12?
Under
You know?
20. Yeah,
Under 20.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the lab that you use. So, I mean, that's another challenge, is even if you get a well-intended physician to order fasting insulin, they're responsive to their patient's request, they're going to look at a 10 or a 15 or an 18 and say, you're in the normal range, things look good. So there's this added layer of complexity and challenge when it comes to that interpretation, that even if we can get behavior change in the medical space, there's still a learning curve to it.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of gamification involved there too for patients, because all it takes is one conversation to let them know, like, hey, your metabolic health is really doing pretty good. However, the best fasting insulin I've seen is 4. And, a
That's
lot
if
of
you work
people,
with these like high achieving type A executives. So
exactly,
much,
right.
you know
They're
how
like,
to
oh,
work
how do
it.
I get to a 4? And then you start doing continuous glucose monitor and watching their
Right.
carbs and all those things. And so I think, I think it helps some people, certain mindsets, like you said, like type A individuals that are really wanting to optimize every number. And not everyone needs to do that, but I think it is important to educate our patients so that they can make the decision about what they want to optimize and how important it is in their day-to-day life.
What are the biggest concerns people come into the clinic with? Is it like cognitive health, cardiovascular protection?
You know what? I'll tell you that the number one concern that people have, and it's not a medical diagnosis, is they know there's more out there and they're not getting it from their typical doctor visits. They know that there is a world that they can be healthier, and they also don't want to be blindsided by a diagnosis in the future that requires a pharmaceutical intervention. And so I think it's more, I think the number one thing people come in for is knowledge about their own bodies, knowledge about what's optimal, knowledge about how they can know what's going on under the hood of their health.
I love that. I mean, that's a truly proactive strategy. It's not like I have pain, I have fatigue. It's even pre that initial early symptom picture that they're coming in.
Yeah. And a lot of people come in with no symptoms, and that's great. Like we want to start checking when you have no symptoms, because by the time you develop a symptom, it's sometimes hard to turn around, right? And so
Yeah.
That being said, a lot of people come in with gut health issues, brain fog, energy levels being low is a huge problem, fatigue, and I think all of those are just ignored until we actually get a diagnosis in the typical world. And now people don't want to ignore those types of feelings. They want to do something about it because they know there's a world where they can live with more energy and more vitality.
I love that. And I love that the quarterly baseline. I'm such a big fan of baseline labs. Like I work with women in their kind of 30s, 40s, 50s zone predominantly. And I love for them to get very complete assessment as early as possible, even earlier than 40s if possible, because you want to know what optimal looks like for you. You don't want to be tested when you're sick. And I use the example of thyroid. Like the range for thyroid, let's say it's 0.5 to 4 is considered normal with labs. If you come in and you're like a 1.9, a lot of women don't feel good there. And it's because maybe when they were in their 20s, they were a 0.5 or a 0.6, and that was their normal. And I tell my patients it's like your shoe size, right? The normal shoe size for a woman, let's say it's a 5 to a 10. I'm sorry if you're outside that range. I don't mean to be excluding anybody that's listening. But if you are a size 6 foot and a size 9 shoe, it's not a fit, right? And likewise, if you're an 8.5 and you're trying to squeeze your foot into a size 6, you're going to feel pretty terrible, even though you're still in the normal range. And I think when patients get that a lot, and it makes sense. It's like, this is why you need to know how things are changing over time and not just be dismissed for being within the normal range, because the normal range is just so broad for most of these parameters.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it also brings up another point is we have a lot of patients that come in and they're like, oh, I don't need my blood work done. I feel amazing. I'm in the best shape I've ever been. I feel just great. I'm like, this is exactly the time that we want to know what your numbers show. So we know what your TSH is at this moment in time. We know what your testosterone is. We know what your numbers are when you are feeling really, really good. So later, when you don't feel good, or these numbers change, we know what we need to aim for. And so it's important, people ask, like, at what age should I get my blood work done? I'm like, even 21 makes sense, 25. Yeah. Get it when you're feeling good, so we know what those numbers look like.
Well, I want to shift gears and kind of hone in and focus in on hormones a little bit more. And I want to start with one that probably people wouldn't suspect, which is cortisol. Because you see, especially with your patient population, high functioning, high achieving people, we all carry a burden of stress, right? Some historical, some modern day. Tell me a little bit about the role that you see stress play in your patient's health and how it shows up in testing.
Well, what I would say is that people have stress in their life, right? And what I try to do is try to normalize that. It is normal to have stress in your day-to-day life. But the problem with stress is that when you let it build up to it causing physiological damage. And so what does that look like? Physiological damage from stress looks like, first and foremost, we see autonomic dysregulation, and that manifests itself as a problem with your HRV levels, right? And so the people just living in a state of being sympathetic all the time and never giving themselves time in the parasympathetic zone. When you live in that for more than 30 to 45 minutes, that leads to a release of cortisol, right? And when you're at a level of cortisol that is higher than what your baseline is at a parasympathetic state, but then you stay there, then that becomes your new normal. And if that becomes your new normal, the next time you do add a little bit of stress to that, you go even higher, and then you go even higher. And I try to explain this whole kind of sequence of events to people so they understand the importance of building in breaks throughout their day, building in time to be parasympathetic throughout their day. And there's lots of different ways to do that, obviously. But it's a massive problem because once again, hypercortisolemia and leading into parasympathetic and sympathetic dysregulation and having poor HRV, all of that is another root cause of chronic disease.
Well, I want you to dive into HRV a bit more if you're open to that, because I think that's a marker that like most of us can access if you're using a wearable.
Absolutely.
But I think out of all the things that are measured, it has the least understanding. Can you talk a little bit more about heart rate variability and like what it means and how you use it clinically?
Yeah. So, just kind of describing heart rate variability to someone who's never heard it, I always start off telling people is very simply the time in between heartbeats. And the time in between heartbeats is regulated by your nervous system. And there's two nervous systems that we have that are actually at play influencing the time in between heartbeats. That is the sympathetic nervous system that wants our heartbeat to be very regular, and our parasympathetic nervous system that wants our heartbeat to slow down. And those two nervous systems are always kind of interplaying, and you get millisecond differences between heartbeats. And the counterintuitive idea here is that the more variability that there is in the time in between your heartbeats, the better your nervous systems are interacting, because they really are able to play against each other. So you want a higher HRV, not a low HRV. And heart rate variability, quite simply, is just an interplay between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And you want to aim for more time in the parasympathetic state so that you have better and higher numbers in your HRV. And it's a great master, I would say, master number that you can look at on a day-to-day basis, using like a wearable to really understand, how's my body doing? How am I doing? And a lot of times when you ask people like, how are you doing? They're going based on their symptoms, but symptoms are such a lagging indicator of if anything's really going on. Whereas HRV can tell you decades prior to you getting symptoms about how your body's doing.
I love that description. I'm going to utilize that if that's okay with you. I think that's such a great way to explain it. And it's really interesting because we always talk about like leading indicators and lagging indicators in businesses and healthcare, et cetera. It's definitely a concept that resonates with a lot of people. And when we look at cortisol changes, I was talking about this like literally on the phone on my way to the studio with one of our other docs on the team. It seems as though culturally, like in integrative and functional medicine, we need to revamp the way we talk about cortisol and stress and even assessment. That's one thing that I've really become very passionate about at Dutch, because when I was first in practice, I did salivary cortisol curves, which is a free cortisol diurnal pattern. And I think now about how many problems I missed by only looking at that. And what I was talking about with Dr. Smith is that that is the last thing to change when it comes to stress. Like we see so many other patterns. We see cortisol metabolism change. We see the shift to cortisone change. And we measure all these on the Dutch test because we do urine metabolites as well. And I just think about, and the CAR, let's not forget the CAR, the cortisol awakening response. The diurnal pattern is the last thing to change on the road to dysfunction when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, that if you're only looking at it as a provider, you're probably missing that opportunity to do early intervention. I would add HRV to that category of like early leading indicators. That I really want to put that together in a way that we could talk about more comprehensively, because I think that's something that we just don't do very well as a integrative medicine group. It's like the toughest area for clinicians to work on with their patients.
Yeah, it's so true. And we all know that stress is a massive influencer in our overall health across every single body system, right? But all we have to look at traditionally to figure out how much of a factor it is in our patient's health is like cortisol levels, right? And so,
or AM serum cortisol.
That's serum cortisol, right? Yeah. And like you said, that's one of the last things. It's like using hemoglobin A1C to see if someone is metabolically healthy. Well, that's the last thing that's going to change, right? You want to catch us decades ahead of time. And finally we have, and you can argue about the accuracy of it, and you can argue about, a lot of things about HRV, but what I can tell you is that in real clinical practice, HRV is an excellent preventative indicator for stress becoming an issue in your life later on. And so if you're actively managing your HRV when, like now, but as soon as possible, before waiting for your cortisol curves to show, to show some dysregulation, you're gonna way be ahead of the game as far as preventing problems with stress affecting your physiology, your disease risk, all of that.
Yeah, you're lighting a fire in me with this one, for sure. And I think the other thing that's so interesting is that so many clients, and I can resonate this myself, speak personally about it, like we have a high tolerance for stress.
Yes.
And so if you asked me, how's your stress level? I'd be like, it's fine. It's good. 5 kids, working mom, like juggling household, all that stuff. There's so much happening in my life, but it's under control. I'm not feeling like pain. There's always stress. There's a lot going on. Yeah. But when you have these other metrics that can be monitored, it cuts through the like emotional component of how much we think we can tolerate. And I really, really like that.
Yeah, it's really, it's so true. I mean, humans are resilient. We're such resilient beings, especially to stress. Humans have lived stress since we became humans, right? And we rely on stress to create appropriate physiological responses. Unfortunately, in the last 80 years, we've manufactured so many more ways to live in a constant state of stress that it's adding to real physiological damage. And understanding how much our body is stressed, how much we can affect it way before we have symptoms or problems is so critical. I'm really excited also about, other wearables like devices that can measure sweat levels of cortisol, for example, on a continuous basis, like we have with continuous glucose monitors. I think tools like that are just going to give us more data and more clarity into what's really happening.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I mean, the way we can measure the expansion and what we can measure it's transforming, which is so exciting. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about reproductive hormone levels as well. When you think about your clients that are coming into you for longevity and health span, why is it important to take a look at a woman's cycle or her perimenopausal, menopausal transition, or for men, testosterone and those other reproductive hormones?
So what I can tell you is that unfortunately, we have this kind of wall of understanding that was created by the Women's Health Initiative study and also studies around testosterone and heart disease that permeated through society over the last few decades that created this almost irrational fear of hormone replacement therapy to the point where, I think I heard Peter Attia describe this on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago as being criminal. And it really
I think he called it the biggest mistake has ever been made in medicine or something like that. I've heard
really
him say
is, yeah.
something that
And
powerful.
I think if you truly understand what we've missed over the last, 50 years, it's really sad, right? Because we'd be so far ahead of the game right now. And so we know that testosterone and estrogen are hormones of longevity. They lead to incredibly beneficial consequences when normalized for both men and women, right? And so I think that obviously testing it is important, but also not having a fear of creating a situation where your hormones are normalized later on in life. The reality situation is we're living a lot longer as humans, and our glands that produce these hormones get exhausted over time. Just like our mitochondria gets exhausted, just like our growth hormone gets exhausted over time. Like we're just living longer as humans. We weren't built to create hormones for as long as we're living. But guess what? We have modern technology that we can now replace these hormones. And there's different ways of doing it. We can encourage our own natural production to a certain degree. And when that doesn't work, we can replace. And when you replace, you avoid all sorts of chronic diseases and you actually live a better and fuller life. And so this can be done very safely with good practitioners that really know what they're doing, that understand the testing, and with further like three-dimensional assessments like the Dutch test, we can really do this with incredible accuracy, safety, and be able to create a situation where people are living their most vital lives, right? And so I'm excited about it. I'm excited about turning the narrative. I'm excited about people having more access to information. But the reality is we still have a wall of knowledge, of lack of knowledge in the medical community where all the doctors that have been educated back in the 80s when I was educated in medicine, we were taught that, hormone replacement therapy is a devil.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the WHI came out when I was a medical student. So, I mean, I was just starting my clinical. So same thing. It was like my gynecology teacher was like, cutting edge information. Look at this. So definitely it's hard to get re-educated on it if you're in
a lot
a
of
busy
doctors got
practice.
sued. A lot of doctors got sued for causing cancers and so many things because of, prescribing hormone therapy. And a lot of doctors even got their licenses taken away for continuing to prescribe hormone therapy despite the Women's Health Initiative study. And, it was so traumatic, right? And, back in the 80s, you grew up in a situation where the biggest thing that you feared as being a doctor was getting sued, right? They just created so much anxiety over having to defend yourself in a lawsuit that there was no way a doctor was going to prescribe hormone replacement
Totally.
therapy.
Yeah. I mean, it's like your whole identity is wrapped up in providing care. The last thing you'd want is like the stress, but more the shame or the consideration that you
shame.
might have harmed a patient, the shame with your colleagues, the shame of not, doing that first do no harm that you really set out to do. You're getting me thinking about that time frame, which Amy Killen just put out a Substack where she talked about, like, do you remember those Cenogenics ads? She said it was like in an airline magazine, and I exactly saw that same ad in a magazine like in the 90s with the guy, the founder, who was like really,
Yeah.
really jacked, bald guy, older
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah.
And that during that time, if you could brand hormone therapy, that was the brand. And it was
Right.
so different from like everyday you and me, which I think really slowed the uptake of that or the transition. I mean, there was research data, but there was also this kind of brand image that had to be overcome where hormone therapy was not about looking like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I trained in Cenogenics back in
Okay,
the day.
cool. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously it was so attractive to like think about reversing the clock, but I just have that picture in my head of that time of the only people doing hormone therapy were people who were looking at that type of building. It's not a dig at all.
No, I mean, look, Alan Mintz founded Cenogenics, and he was a radiologist, and he sold his radiology company, and he got really into growth hormone replacement. And I think it's a really good example of medicine kind of taken too far, right? And so, just like testosterone therapy and bodybuilders, there is the temptation of, wow, I feel so good, I need more and more and more of this, right? And Alan Mintz, and I think there was another orthopedic surgeon, the one that you're talking about, the bald guy with the big muscles and the airline
Yes.
ads. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they did a lot of IGF, and they were just taking straight growth hormone, and they were really taking it to a level that was super physiologic. And I think what you and I are talking about is not super physiology. We're talking about
Exactly.
just, avoiding complications and just being optimized. And when are we the most optimized? Probably in our 20s, right? In our late 20s. And just aiming for those levels, I think is a good way to do it.
Yeah, my point is that was kind of like the devil look of
Yeah.
what it's like when people said, "Oh, you don't want to do hormone therapy." That's only for that's wild card.
Yeah.
Those are the cowboys that are out there doing it. But it's great that it's been kind of brought back in to everyday care, and it's also slow. When I think about all of the generations of women that have been women in particular who've been denied hormone therapy during that period of time that we don't have a lot of good solutions for, unfortunately, because there is some risk with getting back on after a period of time that you have not had natural production. So,
Well, I think about my poor mom, who's 8 inches shorter than when I first met her, and she's had every joint in her body replaced, right? And that's because her doctors told her that hormone replacement therapy was dangerous, will cause breast cancer, and she never did it. And now, she's suffering all the consequences. And by the way, she's on medications for diabetes and high blood pressure and all of that stuff. So.
yeah, hopefully we can prevent that for the next generation.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit when it comes to hormone therapy. Like, you obviously work with this for women and men in a more moderate fashion than what we were talking about before. But there's a lot of other therapies that can be layered on. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on, like, what are you using in the clinic? What is the trending things? We have stem cell therapy, we have peptides, we have all these things that people are asking about. What are the things that you have found to be most impactful so far?
So, I think another leg of the stool of just root cause management that doesn't get enough airtime is our level of toxic exposure right now.
Oh, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, we have to continually talk about this because it's so invisible, right? I mean, it's in our air, our water, our food, our skincare products, and it's just invisible. And we don't know, even with lab testing, we don't know the damage this is causing and is leading to damage in every organ system and on a day-to-day basis for all of us. And so I like to do a lot of education around toxin exposure. We do use a urine test for toxins through Vibrant America, measuring 85 different environmental toxins. And we can also talk about mold toxins and Lyme disease and some of these other indolent infections that people don't know that they're exposed to or are suffering from. And what we're finding is that we're doing a lot of work around detoxification. And one of the treatments that we brought out of the hospital into more routine care is called plasma exchange. Have you heard of plasma exchange yet?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So we're doing a lot of plasma exchange. We did over 500 last year, and we'll probably do double that this year. And that's because we found it to really, truly significantly affect people's toxin levels and by measuring before and after urine toxin screens. And obviously, we're doing it as like giving the body a chance to catch up. And it gives people a temporary kind of, it's like an oil change for your body where we eliminate all the toxins that's accumulated in the plasma and also replace the albumin so the albumin can go back into the body, new albumin can go back into the body and bind the toxins throughout the organ systems. And we find significant reductions, and then simultaneously we're reducing exposure. We're reducing all sorts of exposure in their skincare products, in their water, not drinking out of plastic bottles, filtering their water, filtering their air, all of it. And that's kind of a program that we put into place that's really, I think, moving significantly people's risk of chronic disease.
Do you guys measure GGT on your quarterly panel?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great marker, like it's a a really sensitive like liver enzyme that has so much data, for those of you listening, so much data on the level of exposure to toxins. It's one of the first things to respond to toxins, and it's a little bit more of a general marker. But even in the normal range, if you're in the high end of the normal range, it's probably a problem for you. It's really interesting. Joe, I don't know if you know Joe Pizzorno's work, but he's done tons of data on this. Are you familiar with Dr. Pizzorno?
No.
Oh my gosh, I'd love to make an introduction for you guys. He was the founder of Bastyr University. He's a naturopath, but he's done a lot. Like he created one of the first AI tools, 15 years ago, probably, to consolidate all the literature and like pull in lab values and publish, and really early leading. But his whole work lately, he has a consumer facing book called The Toxin Solution, which is great. It'd be a great one to add to your bookshelf in the clinic. But his whole maybe last 20 years has been committed to looking at toxin research. He's based in Seattle, but he worked with this Canadian, I think it was an automobile dealer association or some kind of like mechanical related group. And they took everybody in the pool, and he took the highest quartile of like heart disease, like traditional metabolic and cardiovascular markers, tested them and compared them to the group with the healthiest cardiovascular markers, and found that actually the toxin level was a more impactful indicator of cardiovascular health than even diet, lifestyle, stress, et cetera. Just this kind of missed piece. And then he's done a lot of work on detox programs and stuff like that to bring people down. Anyway, he is the Toxin Solution book, one thing that's nice about it for you as you're listening, it has an appendix that he has summarized all of the different markers in the blood that can indicate toxicity. And he has like a scoring system, like platelet count, GGT, bilirubin. There's all these other markers that are on that list. Anyway, have a look at it. It's definitely it's a great book. Scientific.
I'm sorry. No, I was going back to alcohol. GGT is an excellent marker of how much you're drinking, and so AST and ALT, the other two liver markers, you have to do a lot of damage before they change, but GGT can really just change even like week to week based on your level of alcohol consumption. And so what I try to get a lot of people to do during dry January is at the end of the month, measure their GGT. And then every quarter when we do your quarterly blood test, let's see where you're at. And let's see how much have you been accumulating,
It's an honesty keeper. It's like
an honesty keeper. Right, exactly.
I mean, it is so important. I mean, you look at like the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease on top of fatty liver disease. Like there's so much that's contributing to that, and that's becoming kind of a new epidemic that we're really having to be aware of.
We do a liver scan on people at our clinics as well. This is a fantastic ultrasound scan of people's liver that tells us how much fibrosis you have, which is due to toxins, and how much fatty liver disease, which is usually due to metabolic health abnormalities and also alcohol. And once again, it tells you way, way sooner than even changes in your blood tests how much liver damage you're doing with your lifestyle. And, just one of my really close friends, I made him do this. He just came to the clinic with me one day, just check it out. And we found he had a lot of fatty liver disease. And we, went down the rabbit hole on that. But these kind of tests can save your life, and it's very important that people know what they are and have access to them.
Well, what's really exciting to me about our conversation today is that when we look at medicine, obviously there's this focus on early intervention and prevention. And I think prevention has traditionally been early detection when it comes to like pap smears, for example. That's how we consider prevention of cervical cancer. It's not from a root cause perspective, it's early detection. Mammograms for breast cancer, et cetera. And I think you guys have brought this to the next level with looking at clinically validated tools that can recognize kind of macro and micro trends that show up even before those other changes of the early detection studies do, which is a very exciting place to be headed in medicine. So I know it's not easy to be carving a path like that, but I'm certainly grateful to you and your team for the work that you're doing on that.
I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I like to talk about preventative medicine a lot too. Preventative medicine, we grew up in doing things like colonoscopies, pap smears, right? And those are fantastic. But like you said, those are for disease detection. You're not really preventing disease. What you're doing is preventing a disease from getting out of control and costing the healthcare system too much money. And the reason I say that is because the preventative medicine tests that we have made available to us through insurance are there based on population-based studies that if we test the population, we'll save a lot of money on the back end, making sure we don't have to be resecting colon cancers. So let's make sure people are getting colonoscopies early on in life. But the reality is you're not really preventing anything. What you're doing is just early diagnostics of an actual disease process that has already taken place before it gets out of control. True preventative medicine, which I like to call hyper-preventative medicine, is mitigating the root causes of diseases so you never get a disease in the first place. And that's what we've been talking about here all day today. What that involves is, number one, obviously getting your metabolic health and your nutrition in order. Number two, making sure you're sleeping well. And by that doesn't just mean getting 7 hours of sleep. It means making sure you're getting enough deep sleep. And so a wearable is going to tell you that. Understanding how much movement you have throughout your day, and not just exercising. Like going to the gym doesn't mean that you're doing enough. You have to be moving throughout the day with micro bursts of movement and getting enough steps in. Detoxifying your life, like we've been talking about, that's another root cause, critical factor. And then once you hit your 30s, or sometimes even for people earlier, is getting your hormones in order. And I think once you start doing all of those 5 kind of root causes, managing those those basics of health, you can avoid all the diseases in the future. And then that's true hyper preventative medicine. And I think that kind of like puts a bow around our entire conversation there.
Thank you for wrapping that for me. I don't even need to say anything. Goodbye. Mic drop.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you joining us, Dr. Shah, on the pod again today. Certainly, if you guys are interested in this type of care, our conversation actually a year ago was quite different. So take a look at that episode, have a listen. A lot's changed in that time with what you guys are doing at Next Health. You've grown a lot, but also we talked a lot more about the system and kind of some of the barriers to this type of medicine being adopted, which I think was its own really interesting conversation. So anyway, I really appreciate your time. I'm so glad you're able to join me today. And all of you listening, thanks for joining. We launch a new episode every Tuesday, so be sure to follow us and subscribe so that you can catch every single juicy episode just like this one. Thank you so much. Have a great week.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Dutch Podcast. Join us every Tuesday for new conversations with leading functional health experts. If you like what you've heard, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.